What if the first civilization we know about was not really the first one at all? Under the deserts of southern Iraq, there are clay tablets that are 5,000 years old. These tablets show how Venus moved across the sky with such accuracy that we only proved it correct with modern telescopes. The tablets have math problems for right triangles, math ideas that wouldn't be officially written down in the Western world for another 1,000 years. They have star maps showing the heavens using a counting system based on the number 60, which we still use today to measure time and angles. And here is what bothers us the most. These amazing things showed up suddenly in old historical records around 3100 BC, already complete with no simple earlier versions, no slow development, no mistakes to learn from. It was as if the knowledge just arrived already finished. The people who made these tablets lived between two great rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. We call them the Sumerians, the birthplace of civilization, the first to write, to build cities, to record the movements of the stars and planets. But their tablets have something else. Stories. Myths that seem less like made-up tales and more like actual memories. Stories of knowledge passed down from beings they called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Records of 8 kings who ruled before a great flood. Their time as kings measured not in years but in tens of thousands of years. 241,000 years total. Let that number sit with you for a moment. And these records are not written like myths. They are written in the same boring, businesslike way used to count grain and silver. As if impossible numbers were just another kind of list. As if beings coming down from the sky were normal office records. As if the impossible were ordinary. The tablets whisper a question older than any answer we have. If the Sumerians were the beginning, then what was this knowledge they said they received? And if they were not the beginning, then what came before? Before we go down into those buried records together, take a moment if you want to like this video and subscribe. Only if this is the kind of mystery you want to think about before sleep. And if you're still listening, still awake, tell me in the comments. Where are you in the world right now? What time is it where the night finds you? I like to imagine this quiet stretching across continents and time zones. All of us alone together, listening to the same ancient whisper. The story does not begin with answers. It begins the way all true mysteries begin, with archaeologists reaching into earth that has not been touched for 5,000 years, with pieces of clay that refused to stay quiet. The oldest writing in the world showed up suddenly, not through slow change, not through gradual invention. It simply appeared, fully formed in the clay of southern Iraq around 3100 BC. For 5,000 years, that writing lay buried under sand and ruins, forgotten by every empire that rose and fell above it. Until the late 1800s, when archaeologists reached the deepest layers under ancient mounds and found something unexpected. Thousands of clay tablets covered in wedge-shaped marks. Writing older than Egypt, older than China, older than any alphabet the world had ever seen. And here is what stopped them cold. This ancient writing was not simple or basic. It was not the clumsy marks of people learning to write for the first time. It had math, astronomy, medicine, law all appearing at once, as if knowledge itself had arrived complete. One tablet from the ancient city of Nippur lists over 200 healing plants, each with its specific use and how to prepare it. Another records how Venus moved across the sky with such accuracy that modern astronomers can use it to date ancient events. A third has math calculations for right triangles, a math idea that would not be officially described in the West for another 1,000 years. These are not basic experiments. These are improvements. The work of minds that already understood what they were doing. The people who made these tablets lived in the land between two rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates. We call them the Sumerians, and their wedge-shaped writing pressed into wet clay with cut reeds is called cuneiform. But the Sumerians did not only record practical knowledge. They also recorded something stranger. Stories that read less like fiction and more like memory. The Enuma Elish describing how the world was created from the body of a killed goddess. The Atrahasis telling of humanity's creation and a great flood sent to silence the earth. And then there is one text that doesn't fit any category. The Sumerian king list. This document records the names of kings who ruled before a terrible flood. But here's what makes it strange. It measures their time as kings not in years but in tens of thousands of years. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. Alalgar, 36,000 years. And Menluana, 43,200 years. 8 kings in total ruling for 241,000 years. Yet the king list is written in the same dry, businesslike way used to record shipments of barley and counts of livestock. No metaphor, no poetry, just numbers and names, as if someone were filing an office report about the impossible. When French archaeologist Ernest de Sarzeck uncovered the first major collection of these tablets in the 1870s, he wrote in his journal, "We are not looking at the birth of writing. We are looking at something it inherited." He was right. The more tablets they found, the clearer it became. The Sumerians did not invent their knowledge. They recorded it. They saved it, as if they were record keepers of something older. And perhaps that is why they wrote with such care. Why they pressed each mark so carefully into the clay. Why they baked the tablets hard, knowing fire would make them last forever. They were not writing for themselves. They were writing for us, for the future, for anyone who might one day learn to read again. There is a fingerprint on one of the tablets kept in the British Museum. A smudge left by a scribe's thumb 5,000 years ago, pressed into the wet clay before it was baked. If you look closely at the photograph, you can see the ridges, the swirls, the small imperfection where the skin once touched the earth. That fingerprint belongs to someone who believed what they were writing mattered. Someone who thought the clay would last longer than stone, longer than empire, longer than memory itself. And they were right. The clay survived. The empires did not. But the question remains, if the Sumerians were saving knowledge, not discovering it, then where did that knowledge come from? Who taught them to list the stars? Who showed them the math of right angles? Who told them the story of 8 kings who ruled before the flood? The tablets do not say, or perhaps they do, and we have not yet learned how to read them properly. In 1922, a British archaeologist named Herbert Weld Blundell made a discovery in the ruins of the ancient city of Larsa. What he found would force every scholar of the ancient world to face a single impossible question. If this is the beginning of history, then what came before? In 1922, a British archaeologist named Herbert Weld Blundell was digging in the ruins of Larsa, an ancient Sumerian city in southern Iraq, when his workers uncovered something unusual in the third layer of debris. A clay prism, four-sided, about 8 inches tall, covered entirely in cuneiform writing. The clay had been baked hard millennia ago, harder than stone, and every surface was covered with tiny wedge marks arranged in perfect columns. It was heavy in his hands, deliberate, made to last. Weld Blundell carefully wrapped it and sent it back to Oxford, where it now rests in the Ashmolean Museum. Scholars call it the Weld Blundell Prism, and it would turn out to be one of the most important artifacts ever recovered from ancient Mesopotamia. But in that moment, standing in the dust of Larsa with clay pressed against his palms, Weld Blundell could not have known what he was holding. A list, a record, a document that would force every historian of the ancient world to face a single impossible question. When the prism was finally translated, it had something that should not exist: the names of kings, dynasties, cities stretching backward through time in careful businesslike order. But the numbers attached to those names were wrong. Not slightly wrong, terribly wrong. One king, the text claimed, had ruled for 28,800 years. Another for 36,000. A third for 43,200 years. 8 kings in total reigning over 5 cities for a combined 241,000 years. And then after those 8 names, a single line. Then the flood swept over. After that, the times as kings became shorter, reasonable, human, hundreds of years, then decades, then the lifespans we recognize today. As if something had changed. As if time itself had been reset. Weld Blundell was not alone in his confusion. By the early 1900s, archaeologists were uncovering Sumerian tablets across southern Iraq. At Nippur, the ancient religious center, they found temple archives holding thousands of office records, hymns, and chronicles. At Ur, the legendary birthplace of Abraham, they dug up royal tombs filled with treasures and carved cylinders. At Uruk, one of the oldest cities on Earth, they discovered layers of occupation going down more than 5,000 years into the past. And among all those pieces, one text kept appearing. Different versions, different scribes, different centuries, but always the same structure, always the same impossible numbers, always the same 8 kings before the flood. One version was found in Nippur, copied by a scribe in the Old Babylonian period around 1700 BC, already ancient when it was written. Another came from the ruins of Isin, broken but recognizable. A third showed up in the library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, saved because the palace had burned and baked the clay tablets into lasting form. These were not separate myths passed down through spoken tradition and changed over time. These were independent business records separated by hundreds of miles and hundreds of years, all describing the same sequence, the same cities, the same names, the same terrible interruption. The American scholar Samuel Noah Kramer spent decades translating these tablets. He called the Sumerians history's first civilization and devoted his career to understanding their worldview. In his notes on the king list, he wrote, "The consistency is what troubles us. If this were myth, we would expect changes, but changes are minimal, as if the scribes were copying from a source they believed to be factual." His colleague Thorkild Jacobsen, a Danish expert who became the leading authority on the Sumerian king list, went further. He studied every known version, comparing reign lengths, city names, and flood references. His conclusion was careful but clear. The king list, he wrote, is not a creation myth. It is an attempt at writing history. The question is not whether the Sumerians believed it. The question is why they believed it. Why would a civilization known for being exact in math and astronomy, a people who could predict lunar eclipses and calculate compound interest, record such impossible numbers as if they were business facts? Why would scribes across centuries and cities all agree on figures that go against human biology, geology, and common sense? Unless they were not inventing, unless they were saving something. There is something deeply unsettling about the way these texts are written. The tone is not mythic. It does not soar with poetic language or call upon divine mystery. It reads like a tax record, like a census, flat, matter-of-fact, businesslike. In Eridu kingship, Alulim ruled 28,800 years. Alalgar ruled 36,000 years. The throne passed to Bedtibara. Menluana ruled 43,200 years. No explanation, no justification, just the numbers. As if accounting for grain shipments or labor shifts. As if someone were filing a report about the ordinary passage of time, even though the time being reported was anything but ordinary. And then, after the flood, the records continue. Kingship, the text says, descended again from heaven. New dynasties arose in Kish, in Uruk, in Uar. But the numbers shrank, gradually at first, then quickly, until the kings ruled for lifespans we would recognize. Lifespans that fit within the limits of what we know to be biologically possible. The Sumerians themselves seemed to have understood that something had changed. That the world after the flood was not the same as the world before it. The reigns of the antediluvian kings, the ones who ruled before the waters came, belonged to a different order of time, a different order of existence. But they recorded them anyway, carefully, exactly, as if they mattered, as if future generations needed to know. The king list is not a single document. It is a tradition, a memory saved across centuries, copied and recopied by scribes who may not have fully understood what they were writing, but knew it was too important to let die. And buried within those impossible numbers lies a pattern, a code, something the Sumerians were trying to tell us about the world before the flood, about how time once moved differently, or perhaps about who once measured it. There is a pattern hidden in the impossible numbers, a code written in clay 5,000 years ago that refuses to give up its meaning. The Sumerian king list does not begin with a creation story. It does not call upon gods or speak in metaphor. It begins the way a ledger begins, with a place, with a name, with a number. In Eridu kingship, Alulim became king and ruled 28,800 years. That is the first line, simple, direct, businesslike, and completely impossible. 8 kings are listed before the flood. Their combined reigns total 241,200 years. Longer than the pyramids have stood, longer than any civilization we know has lasted, longer than our entire understanding of human history. And yet these numbers were not written as mythology. They were recorded with the same exactness used to count barley shipments and silver payments, as if accounting for the ordinary passage of time. as if someone were filing an office report about the impossible. For more than a century, scholars tried to explain them away. Symbolic, they said. Mythological exaggeration. The numbers must represent something other than actual time. Perhaps months instead of years. Perhaps dynasties instead of individuals. Perhaps scribal errors added up over thousands of years. But there is a problem with every explanation. A problem that becomes clear when you look closely at the math. Because the numbers follow a pattern. The ancient Sumerians counted differently than we do. We use base 10, organizing numbers in groups of 10, 100, 1000. The Sumerians used base 60 sexagesimal, a system so advanced that we still use it today to measure time and angles. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. Within that system, they had a unit called a sar. 1 sar equals 3,600 years. It was their measurement for huge cosmic cycles, for the slow march of constellations across the night sky, for ages that stretched beyond human memory. Now look at the king list again. Look at it through Sumerian eyes. Look at what the numbers actually are. Alulim of Eridu, 28,800 years. That is exactly 8 sar. Not approximately. Exactly. The second king, Alalgar, also of Eridu, 36,000 years. 10 sar. Precise. The third, Menluana of Betibara, 43,200 years. 12 sar. Perfect. The pattern continues through all 8 kings. And Menluana, 8 sar. Dumuzi, 10 sar. And Ensipsiana, 8 sar again. The last two, Enmendarana and Ubartutu, measure 5.8 and 5.1 sar, breaking the perfect pattern slightly but still clearly based on the same unit. These are not random numbers made larger by myth. These are calculations, multiples of a measurement system designed to track astronomical events. The reigns of kings measured in the same units used to chart the movements of planets and stars. But why? Why would the Sumerians measure kingship in cosmic time? Why would rulers be given reigns based on celestial cycles, unless they were not recording individual human lives at all? Unless the king list is measuring something else. Epochs, ages, eras of the world defined not by the span of a single reign, but by the turning of the heavens themselves. Or unless, and this is the thought that refuses to leave us, the Sumerians believed they were recording literal truth. That before the flood, time itself worked differently. That what we call impossible was once the ordinary rhythm of existence. And then after recording all 8 of these cosmic reigns with careful exactness, the text states simply, without drama or explanation. Then the flood swept over. After that, everything changed. Kingship descended from heaven once more, the text says, but the numbers shrank. The next dynasty ruling in the city of Kish recorded reigns of 625 years, then 560, then 420. The numbers continue to fall with each generation until finally, by the time we reach the historical kings we can verify through other sources, the reigns fit within normal human lifespans. 30 years, 40 years, lifespans that make sense. The Sumerians themselves seem to have understood that something fundamental had changed. That the world after the flood was not the same as the world before it. The antediluvian kings, those who ruled before the waters came, belonged to a different order of time, a different order of reality. But they recorded both worlds, the impossible and the possible, the cosmic and the human, all in the same calm, businesslike tone, as if keeping records mattered more than being believable. As if the act of saving something justified the strangeness of what was being saved. There is a version of the king list kept in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. A clay prism, four-sided, small. Enough to hold in your hand. It was carved by a scribe named Nirninsabur in the city of Larsa around 1700 BC. More than 1,000 years after the flood it describes. More than 4,000 years before we would try to read it. If you could examine that prism closely, you would see something remarkable. The writing is careful. Each wedge mark is placed with care. The columns are perfectly lined up. There are no corrections, no erasing, no signs of doubt or hesitation. This was not a scribe making up a story. This was someone copying what they believed to be fact, saving it exactly as it had been handed down through generations of previous scribes, each one faithfully passing on what they themselves had received. The Danish scholar Thorkild Jacobsen spent decades studying every known version of the king list. He compared reign lengths across different copies, tracked changes in city names, studied how the text changed over centuries. In his final study, he wrote something that still echoes through Sumerian scholarship today. The problem, he said, is not the numbers themselves. The problem is our assumption that we understand what the numbers mean. If we approach this text as the Sumerians intended it, if we take seriously their mathematical exactness and their consistent transmission, we must at least consider that they were measuring something real. Not human lifespans, but something real. Something that existed before the flood swept it all away. What could that something be? Some scholars argue the numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals, that Alulim was not a single king but a royal house, a family line that ruled for 8 Sar, that the name stood for continuity across generations, not a person. Others suggest the reigns are purely astronomical, that each king represents a celestial cycle, a period when certain constellations dominated the night sky, when cosmic alignments marked the passage of ages. Still others, more cautious, admit only that we do not fully understand. That the king list saves a framework of timekeeping we can no longer decode. That the Sumerians were recording something meaningful to them, something important enough to copy and save across thousands of years. But the key to that meaning has been lost. What we do know is this. The numbers are not random. They are not corrupted. They are not the result of scribal error or mythological inflation. They are deliberate, mathematical, based on a system of cosmic measurement that the Sumerians used to track the movements of the heavens. And they are consistent. Across every version of the king list we have, separated by hundreds of years and hundreds of miles, the same structure appears. 8 kings before the flood, reigns measured in Sar, a terrible interruption, then kingship descending again with numbers that gradually return to human scale. Perhaps this consistency is what troubles us most. Not the impossibility of the claims, but the care with which they were saved. Not the strangeness of the numbers, but the exactness with which they were recorded. As if the Sumerians knew these figures would seem impossible to future generations. As if they wrote them anyway, trusting that one day someone would understand what they were trying to say. As if they were leaving instructions for a world that had forgotten how to read them. The king list ends with the flood. But it does not end with silence. After the waters go down, the text starts again with a single phrase that echoes through every flood myth that followed. Then kingship descended from heaven once more. Not from earth, not from human invention, from heaven. As if kingship were an object, a gift, a technology that could be given, taken away, and given again. And the question that carries us into the next chapter is this. If kingship descended twice from heaven, then what is heaven? And who or what was doing the descending? After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. That is how the Sumerian king list begins. Not with a creation story, not with mythology or metaphor, with a single clear sentence as businesslike as a shipping receipt. Kingship descended. The word choice is strange, exact, almost technical. In Sumerian, the phrase is nam lugal anta, which translates directly as kingship from heaven having been brought down. Not given, not inspired, not ordained, brought down. As if kingship were an object, something physical that could be carried from one place to another, from heaven to Eridu. But what is heaven? And what is Eridu? One of these questions we can answer. The other refuses to stay still. Eridu sits in southern Iraq, about 12 miles southwest of the ancient city of Ur. Today it is called Tel Abu Sharain, a low mound rising from the desert, barely visible against the flat horizon. For most of the year it is empty. Wind, sand. The occasional archaeologist with a permit and a theory. But beneath that sand lies something extraordinary. The first excavations began in 1854, led by John George Taylor, the British consul in Basra. What he found suggested Eridu was older than Ur, older than Uruk, perhaps the oldest city in southern Mesopotamia. Later teams digging deeper through the 1940s and 1950s uncovered 18 successive layers of temples, each one built directly on top of the ruins of the one before, stretching back nearly 7,000 years. 18 temples, all dedicated to the same god Enki, the Lord of the Abzu. The oldest temple at the very bottom of the sequence was small, a simple reed structure, barely more than a shrine. But even that earliest building was lined up to the cardinal directions with geometric exactness. And beside it, archaeologists found clay tablets, some of the oldest examples of writing ever discovered, describing offerings made to Enki, the god of fresh water, of wisdom, of craft and creation. The Sumerians called Eridu the first city. Not the oldest city they knew, the first city. Period. In their cosmology, it was where civilization began, where the fundamental principles of culture and knowledge, were first stored, where the gods taught humanity the arts of living. And it was here, in Eridu, that kingship first descended from heaven. The main temple, dug up most thoroughly in the 1940s, was called the Ibzu, the House of the Abzu. Abzu in Sumerian thought referred to the deep fresh waters beneath the earth, the cosmic ocean from which all life emerged. But it also carried another meaning, the source, the origin, the deep place from which knowledge itself flowed. Enki, the god who lived in the Ibzu, was not a creator god in the sense of making the world. He was something stranger. He was the keeper of the divine decrees that governed reality. Mathematics, writing, metalwork, agriculture, law, music, all the technologies and knowledge that separated civilization from chaos. In one Sumerian myth, the goddess Inanna travels to Eridu to ask Enki for the She finds him in the Abzu, and after much negotiation, sometimes trickery, he gives them to her. She carries them to her city, Uruk, and civilization spreads. The story is told as a myth, yes, but it is also, in a way, a description of transmission, of knowledge moving from one place to another, of wisdom being physically carried and shared. The were not abstract ideas. They were things, objects, tablets, codes, formulas, and they lived in Eridu, guarded by Enki, until they were deliberately given to humanity. So when the king list says kingship descended from heaven and landed in Eridu, it is describing something the Sumerians believed to be a historical event, an actual transfer. Something arrived. Something was given. And the place where it arrived was not random. It was the house of the god who stored all knowledge. But that still leaves the question, what is heaven? The Sumerian word izan can mean sky, can mean the visible heavens. But in Sumerian cosmology and also refers to the realm of the gods, which was not simply up there in some vague spiritual sense. It was a place. It had geography. The gods lived in an, and from an they could descend to the earth. Some scholars interpret this as purely mythological. Heaven as metaphor, the realm of the divine, imagined spatially because ancient minds thought in concrete terms. Kingship descended from heaven means kingship was ordained by the gods, given divine legitimacy, made sacred through ritual. Others are less certain. They point out that the Sumerians used the same word and to describe both the sky they could see and the realm of the gods they could not. And their astronomy was not abstract. They tracked planets which they called gods. They mapped the movements of heavenly bodies with exactness. When they said something came from an, they may have meant literally from the sky, not metaphorically, not spiritually, actually from above. And then there are the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. The name itself in Sumerian breaks down as Anunnaki, which can be translated as the offspring of Anu, or more literally, those of royal seed who came down. Anu was the god of the highest heaven, the most distant realm, and the Anunnaki were his messengers. They descended, they taught, they gave the In later Babylonian texts, the Anunnaki are described as judges, as overseers, as the ones who determine destiny. They are not abstract forces. They are beings with names, roles, and functions. And consistently across hundreds of texts, they are connected with bringing knowledge to humanity, teaching agriculture, teaching writing, teaching law. The question we cannot answer for sure is whether the Sumerians understood this literally or symbolically. Whether they believed actual beings descended from the sky, or whether heaven was always a metaphor for divine wisdom made available to human minds. But there is something worth noticing. The Sumerians were not a people given to vague mysticism. They were accountants, engineers, astronomers. When they wrote myths, they wrote them as literature with clear poetic structure. When they wrote office records, they wrote them plainly. And the king list is written plainly. It does not read like a myth. It reads like a record. After kingship descended from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. Not ordained, not inspired, descended. As if someone were describing an arrival, a landing, a physical transfer of something essential. Perhaps we are meant to read it as metaphor. Perhaps the descent of kingship is simply the moment when human society organized itself enough to need rulers, and the Sumerians, looking back, gave credit for that development to divine help because they could not imagine it happening on its own. Or perhaps the Sumerians recorded what they believed they remembered, that once, long ago, in the city of Eridu, something arrived from the sky. That it brought with it the knowledge and authority to rule. That kingship as an institution did not develop gradually but appeared suddenly, fully formed, with all its rituals, hierarchies, and laws intact. And if that is what they believed, then we must ask why they believed it. What happened in Eridu that made the story of descent not just believable but necessary? Eridu was not alone in its claims. Other cities, other temples, other gods also spoke of knowledge coming from the sky. And buried in the ruins of those cities, archaeologists have found something that should not exist, evidence of technologies that appeared suddenly, without earlier versions, as if taught rather than invented. Mathematics that arrived complete. Astronomy that began already advanced. Writing that showed no slow development. The next chapter takes us deeper into those archives, where the clay speaks of gifts we did not earn and knowledge we claim but cannot explain. In 1912, an antiques dealer in Baghdad sold a small clay tablet to Edgar J. Banks, an American archaeologist and diplomat. The tablet was about the size of a hand, broken at one edge, covered in columns of cuneiform numbers arranged in neat rows. Banks didn't know what it was. He shipped it back to New York, where it eventually made its way to Columbia University. For decades, it sat in storage, catalogued, forgotten, just another piece among thousands, until 1945 when a mathematician named Otto Neugebauer looked at it closely and realized what he was seeing. The tablet, now known as Plimpton 322, had a list of numbers that should not exist. 15 rows of calculations, each one describing the dimensions of a right triangle using Pythagorean principles, the same math that would later be credited to the Greek philosopher Pythagoras, who lived around 500 BC. Except Plimpton 322 was written in 1700 BC, more than 1,000 years earlier. And it was not a theoretical exercise. It was not someone discovering these principles for the first time, working through trial and error, making mistakes and corrections. The tablet was clean, exact, organized like a reference table, like something you would look at when you already knew what you were doing. As if the math had already been perfected long before this particular scribe copied it down. Plimpton 322 is not Sumerian. It dates to the Old Babylonian period, centuries after the Sumerian civilization had faded. But the mathematical system it uses, the base 60 structure, the way numbers are organized and calculated, all of that is Sumerian, inherited, passed down, saved through generations of scribes who copied what had been handed down to them. And it raises a question that echoes through every mathematical tablet we have recovered from ancient Mesopotamia. If the Babylonians inherited this math from the Sumerians, and the Sumerians recorded it as if it were already complete when writing first appeared, then where did it come from originally? Who developed a system advanced enough to calculate Pythagorean triples 1,500 years before Pythagoras? The tablet offers no answer. It simply exists, a piece of knowledge saved in clay, waiting 3,700 years to be understood again. But Plimpton 322 is not alone. Among the thousands of tablets dug up from Nineveh, Babylon, and Uruk, a pattern emerges. The earliest mathematical and astronomical texts do not show slow development. They show application, scribes using formulas they did not invent, calculating with systems they did not design, recording observations according to frameworks that were already ancient when they copied them. The MUL.Appin tablets are among the most important astronomical texts ever recovered. The name means the plow star, referring to a constellation the Mesopotamians used to mark the beginning of the agricultural year. These tablets, copied in the 7th century BC but saving observations that date back centuries earlier, have star catalogs, planetary movements, and an advanced understanding of the relationship between lunar and solar calendars. They describe the heliacal risings of stars, the dates when specific constellations first become visible before dawn. They track the movements of Venus, Jupiter, and Saturn with remarkable consistency. They calculate intercalation, the process of adding extra months to align the lunar year with the solar year, a problem that requires exact long-term observation and mathematical modeling. And here is what unsettles astronomers who study them. The system works. The MUL.Appin tablets are not basic attempts at astronomy. They are polished tools built on centuries of gathered data, organized into a clear framework that allows prediction and calculation. But the earliest layers of that framework, the foundational observations and mathematical principles, appear suddenly in the Sumerian period, fully functional, as if the system had been designed all at once and then simply maintained by later generations. One tablet in particular has captured the attention of historians and astronomers for over a century. The Venus tablet of Ammisaduqa, named after a Babylonian king who ruled around 1600 BC. It records the appearances and disappearances of Venus over a 21-year period, tracking when the planet was visible as a morning star and when it shifted to become an evening star. The observations are exact. The cycles it describes match what we know Venus actually does, with an accuracy that suggests systematic, careful observation over decades. But the tablet is not recording new discoveries. It is copying older records, saving a tradition of planetary observation that stretches back into the Sumerian era. Why were the Sumerians watching Venus so carefully? Why did they track its cycles with such exactness that scribes 1,000 years later could still rely on those records? Some scholars suggest it was for divination. The movements of planets were thought to influence earthly events, so priests tracked them to predict the will of the gods. Others argue it was practical. Agricultural societies needed accurate calendars, and planetary movements provided the most reliable way to measure time. But there is another possibility, one that the tablets themselves hint at, though they never state it directly. Perhaps the Sumerians were not just watching the stars to predict the future. Perhaps they were watching them to remember the past, to maintain a connection to something older, to save a knowledge they had inherited but no longer fully understood. The base 60 system, the SAR measurements, the perfect alignment of temples with celestial points, the sudden appearance of writing already describing astronomical events. All of it suggests a wholeness, a system. Not pieces of knowledge slowly gathered over thousands of years, but a framework already in place, waiting to be recorded. And when we look at the technological artifacts the Sumerians left behind, the pattern continues. Cylinder seals showing complex machinery. Sculptures showing figures holding objects that look like precision instruments. Clay models of what appear to be architectural. Blueprints complete with measurements and proportions. In the ruins of Uruk, archaeologists found evidence of advanced metalworking dating to the very earliest Sumerian layers. Bronze alloys, techniques for casting and annealing, methods that should have taken centuries to develop but appear already polished at the beginning. At Eridu, the oldest temples show geometric exactness in their layout. Not approximate, not good enough, exact. Oriented to the cardinal directions within fractions of a degree, built using units of measurement that match astronomical calculations. How does a civilization just beginning to write already have the mathematical tools to build with such accuracy? How does a people barely moving from scattered villages to urban centers already understand planetary cycles well enough to base their calendar on them? The usual answer is that we are underestimating them, that the Sumerians were simply brilliant, that human cleverness in the 4th millennium BC was capable of far more than we give it credit for, that they observed, calculated, experimented, and discovered all of this on their own in the span of a few centuries. And perhaps that is true. But there is another possibility, one that the Sumerians themselves seem to have believed, that they did not discover these things, that they inherited them, that the knowledge they recorded was already old when they wrote it down, that somewhere before the cities, before the temples, before the king list with its impossible reigns, there was a source, a transmission, something given, not earned. The tablets do not say where that knowledge came from. They only save it carefully, exactly, as if the act of saving were itself a sacred duty, as if they knew that what they carried was not theirs alone, but belonged to a longer chain of transmission that stretched backward into a past they could no longer fully reach. Perhaps that is why they wrote so constantly, why they copied and recopied the same texts across centuries. Why they built libraries and trained scribes and treated clay tablets as treasures worth saving even through conquest and collapse. Because they understood something we are only beginning to suspect. That knowledge is fragile. That it can be lost. That civilizations do not always move in a straight line from simple to complex. Sometimes they remember, and sometimes they forget. But the tablets speak of more than just math and astronomy. They speak of creation itself, of how humanity came to be. And buried in those creation stories is a claim so strange, so specific, that even scholars who dismiss it as mythology cannot quite explain why the Sumerians worded it the way they did. The next chapter takes us into the deepest mystery of all. Not what the Sumerians knew, but what they said they were and who they claimed had made them. In 1924, archaeologists working at the ancient site of Sippar uncovered pieces of a clay tablet that had been buried for more than 3,000 years. The tablet was part of a much larger text, most of which had been lost to time and erosion. But what survived was enough to piece together one of the oldest creation stories ever written. The Atrahasis epic, named after its hero, a wise man who survives a great flood. But before the flood, before the catastrophe, the text describes something else, the moment when humanity began. The story does not speak of divine breath or spiritual awakening. It speaks of engineering, of a deliberate act of creation using specific materials. The gods, the text says, were exhausted from their work. They had worked the earth, dug the rivers, built the world, and they were tired. So they decided to create workers, beings who could carry the burden of maintaining creation. The god Enki, the keeper of wisdom, suggested a solution. They would make humans, but not from nothing. From clay, yes, but also from something divine. To bring the clay to life, to give it spirit, they would need blood. The blood of a god. One of the gods was sacrificed, Wea, a god of intelligence and craft. His blood was mixed with the clay of the earth. And from that mixture, humans were formed. Not purely divine, not purely mortal, a hybrid, carrying within them the essence of both earth and heaven. The Atrahasis is not the only text to describe this process. The Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic drawn from older Sumerian sources, tells a similar story. Humanity shaped from the blood of Kingu, a killed god, mixed with the dust of the earth. The act of creation described almost like a recipe. Ingredients, process, result. These are not metaphors about divine inspiration. They are descriptions of mixture, of combination, of two substances brought together to produce something new. And the language used is specific. The Sumerian word for the divine essence mixed into clay is damu, which means blood but also carries meanings of lineage, inheritance. The substance that passes from generation to generation. It is both physical and conceptual, the fluid of life, the carrier of identity. Why would the Sumerians describe creation this way? Why not simply say the gods spoke humans into existence, as other mythologies do? Why this emphasis on mixing, on blood and clay, on a deliberate process that sounds less like magic and more like craft? Perhaps because they were trying to describe something they believed had actually happened. Not necessarily in the literal sense we might imagine today, but in a way that made sense to them. A way of explaining why humans feel torn between the mortal and the transcendent. Why we are bound to the earth but capable of understanding the stars. Why we carry within us something that seems to remember more than one lifetime should hold. The same pattern appears across cultures separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years. In Genesis 2, the Lord God forms man from the dust of the ground and breathes into his nostrils the breath of life. Dust and breath, earth and spirit, two elements combined to create humanity. In the Hindu Rig Veda, humanity is shaped from the cosmic sacrifice of Purusha, the primal being whose body becomes the material world and whose essence becomes the souls of living things. In the Greek tradition, Prometheus molds humans from clay and Athena breathes life into them. Clay and divine breath. Matter and spirit. The details differ. The names change. But the structure remains, humanity as mixture, as combination, as something made from earth and lifted up by contact with the divine. Why does this pattern repeat? Why do creation myths across unconnected civilizations all describe the same process of mixing earthly matter with divine essence? One possibility is convergence. that human minds trying to explain their own existence naturally arrive at the same metaphor. We are of the earth clearly. Our bodies decay and return to soil, but we are also more than earth. We think, we dream, we create. So ancient peoples imagined that we must be a combination. Matter plus something else. Dust plus divinity. Another possibility is transmission. That these stories share a common ancestor. A single creation myth that spread as humans moved, breaking apart and changing into different versions, but keeping the core structure. The memory of an older story passed down through spoken tradition until it could finally be written in clay, in Sanskrit, in Hebrew, in Greek. But there is a third possibility, one that the myths themselves suggest but never quite state directly. That the language of mixture, of blood and clay, of earthly matter combined with divine essence, was the only way ancient peoples could describe something they observed but could not fully explain. That humans are different. That we emerged suddenly, not gradually. That something about our consciousness, our ability to use language, to build, to record, to wonder, appeared in a way that felt miraculous, discontinuous, as if we had been changed. As if something had been added. Modern genetics has shown us that human evolution is not a smooth line. There are jumps, moments when new traits appear quickly. The development of language sometime between 50,000 and 100,000 years ago. The sudden flowering of symbolic thought, art, ritual around 40,000 years ago. Changes that happen too fast to be explained by gradual natural selection alone. We call these events cognitive revolutions, leaps forward. And we try to explain them through environmental pressures, through lucky mutations, through the complex interplay of genes and culture. But to ancient peoples looking back at their own origins, these changes might have seemed like something else. Like intervention, like mixture, like the moment when Earth met something beyond itself. The Sumerians called it the blood of the gods mixed with clay. We call it the emergence of modern human consciousness. Perhaps we are describing the same mystery in different languages. But here is what unsettles us. The myths do not just say we were created. They say we were created to serve, to work, to maintain what the gods had built. And they say we carry within us the memory of that creation, not just culturally but somehow deeper in the blood itself. Is that possible? Can memory be inherited? Can experiences, knowledge, patterns of thought be passed down not through teaching but through the substance of life itself? Modern science is careful here. We know that trauma can affect gene expression in ways that influence the next generation. We know that certain behaviors, certain tendencies seem to run in families in ways we cannot fully explain through environment alone. Epigenetics has shown us that the genome is not fixed, that experiences can leave marks that are passed on to children. But the idea that specific memories, specific knowledge could be encoded in DNA and passed down across thousands of years, that remains guesswork and proven outside the limits of what we currently understand. And yet the myths insist. They say we remember. They say the blood remembers. They say that what was mixed into us at the beginning still flows through us now, carrying with it an echo of the divine, a piece of knowledge we cannot quite reach but somehow still possess. Perhaps that is why we keep searching, why we dig through ruins and translate ancient tablets and try to decode what the Sumerians meant when they said we were made from the blood of gods. Because somewhere deeper than culture, deeper than language, we feel it too. The sense that we are missing something. That we once knew more than we know now. That memory itself might be older than we imagine. But the myths do not end with creation. They continue to a catastrophe, to the moment when everything the gods had made, everything humans had built, was swept away by water. The Atrahasis tells of a flood sent to silence the world. The Enuma Elish speaks of waters covering the earth. And the next chapter returns us to that moment, to the reset, to the great forgetting, and to the question of what was lost when the waters rose and the old world drowned. In 1928, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley was digging in the ancient city of Shuruppak in southern Iraq when his workers reached an unusual layer about 3 meters below the surface. They had been digging through pottery pieces, clay tablets, building foundations, the normal debris of an ancient settlement, and then suddenly the artifacts stopped. Clean silt, smooth, empty, nearly 3 meters thick. No pottery, no tools, no signs of human living. Just river mud. as if the entire city had been buried beneath a massive flood. Below that layer of silt they found more artifacts, older settlements, evidence of an earlier occupation. Two separate periods of human activity divided by a geological interruption so severe it had effectively reset the city. Whatever happened during that interruption had been terrible enough to bury everything beneath meters of sediment. Woolley knew the site. Shuruppak was mentioned in the Sumerian king list as one of the 5 cities ruled by the antediluvian kings, and according to that list, the last king before the flood, Ubar-Tutu, had ruled from Shuruppak. The text said, "Kingship was in Shuruppak. Then the flood swept over." The layer of silt Woolley found dated to around 2900 BC, right in the middle of the early dynastic period, the same era the king list places the flood. It was not proof, not in the absolute sense. Floods happened regularly in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and Euphrates overflowed their banks. Cities were rebuilt on top of their own ruins. But the scale of the deposit at Shuruppak, the completeness of the interruption, suggested something more than a seasonal overflow. This was an event big enough to be remembered, to be written down, to become, in the minds of those who survived it, the flood, the one that divided time into before and after. And Shuruppak was not the only site. Similar flood deposits were found at Ur, at Kish, at Uruk. Not all from the same date, suggesting multiple terrible floods across different centuries, but all showing the same pattern. Civilization interrupted. Layers of human occupation separated by empty silt. Cities rebuilt on top of their drowned earlier versions. The Sumerians remembered this. They wrote about it not as distant mythology but as recent history, a catastrophe within living memory, or at least within the memory of their grandparents' generation. Close enough to hurt, close enough to mark. But the story they told about the flood was older than the flood itself. The Epic of Gilgamesh, discovered in the ruins of Nineveh in 1853, has one of the most complete versions of the Mesopotamian flood story. In the 11th tablet, Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the man who survived the flood and was granted immortality by the gods. Utnapishtim tells his story. The gods, he says, decided to destroy humanity. The noise of civilization had become unbearable. The earth was too loud, too crowded. Enlil, the god of storm, ordered a flood to silence the world. But Enki, the god of wisdom, could not let humanity die completely. He whispered a warning through the walls of Utnapishtim's reed house. "Build a boat," he said. "Seal it with pitch. Bring the seed of all living things." Utnapishtim built the vessel, a cube each side measuring 120 cubits. He loaded it with his family, craftsmen to save knowledge, animals, and grain. Then the rains came. For 6 days and 7 nights the storm raged. The waters rose. The gods themselves shook in fear at what they had unleashed. Everything beneath the heavens was drowned. When the waters went down, the boat came to rest on a mountain. Utnapishtim released a dove. It returned, finding no place to land. He released a swallow. 2 returned. Finally, he released a raven. The raven did not come back. The earth was emerging again. The story is told simply, almost like a business report, as if Utnapishtim were filing a record about something that had actually happened. The details are exact, the dimensions of the boat, the length of the storm, the sequence of events. It does not read like a moral lesson. It reads like a record, and it is older than the biblical story of Noah by at least 1,000 years. The parallels are too exact to be coincidence. The ark, the animals, the dove, the raven, the mountain. Genesis did not invent these elements. It inherited them from Babylon, from Sumer, from a much older tradition. But here is the question that refuses to settle. If the story is a memory of the Shuruppak flood, or the Ur flood, or any of the regional disasters that buried Mesopotamian cities in silt, why does it describe the flood as global? Why does every version say the entire earth was covered? Why do the gods flee to the highest heavens in terror? A local flood, even a terrible one, would not have covered mountains, would not have required divine escape, would not have erased everything beneath the sky. So either the story exaggerates for dramatic effect or it remembers something larger, something that happened not in 2900 BC but much earlier. Something from which the regional floods were only echoes. Around 12,800 years ago, At the end of the last ice age, the Earth went through a dramatic transformation. The Younger Dryas period, a sudden return to glacial conditions lasting more than 1,000 years, ended suddenly. Temperatures spiked. Ice sheets collapsed. Sea levels rose as glacial meltwater poured into the oceans. Over the course of several thousand years, global sea levels rose about 120 meters. Coastlines that had been dry land for thousands of years were drowned. River valleys flooded. Entire landscapes vanished beneath the advancing sea. If there were settlements on those ancient coasts, and archaeological evidence increasingly suggests there were, they would have been completely wiped out. Some researchers suggest that this post-glacial flooding, spread over thousands of years but marked by rapid surges, is what the flood myths remember. That coastal populations driven inland by rising waters carried with them the memory of a world that had drowned. That this memory, passed down through oral tradition for 10,000 years, eventually hardened into the written flood stories of Sumer, Babylon, and beyond. Others go further. They point to the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, a controversial but increasingly discussed theory that the sudden climate shifts at the end of the Ice Age were triggered by a cosmic impact. A comet or asteroid breaking apart over the North American ice sheet, causing terrible melting, megafloods, and a brief return to Ice Age conditions before the final warming. The evidence is debated. Nanodiamonds found in sediment layers, impact spherules, burn layers across continents. Some scientists argue the data supports a massive impact event. Others remain unconvinced, giving credit to the same evidence to terrestrial processes. The hypothesis is not consensus, but it is also not dismissed. If such an event occurred, if there was a moment 12,800 years ago when the sky fell and the ice melted and the world flooded, it would have been witnessed by human beings. Not Sumerians, who would not exist for another 9,000 years. But humans, anatomically modern, mentally capable survivors who carried the memory forward. And perhaps that is what the myths save. Not the Shurapak flood, not a regional disaster, but the distant echo of an older catastrophe. A memory so deep, so traumatic, that it survived 10 millennia of oral transmission before being written down by the first people who had the technology to record it. The Sumerians would have had no direct memory of the Ice Age, but they might have inherited the story, received it from earlier cultures whose names we no longer know. Cultures who lived before writing, before cities, before the historical threshold. And when the Sumerians experienced their own floods, when Shurpak and Uar and Kish drowned beneath the rivers, those local catastrophes might have resonated with the older story, confirming it, making it feel immediate again. So they wrote it down carefully, exactly, as if it were not just important but essential. As if the memory of the flood was one of the things civilization was meant to save. Because whoever had survived the first flood had also rebuilt. And the Sumerians, rebuilding after their own floods, understood that they were participating in a pattern, a cycle. Destruction and renewal. The world ending and beginning again. The king list makes this clear. Then the flood swept over. After that, kingship descended from heaven once more. The same knowledge, the same institutions, the same divine gifts returning to restart civilization. As if the flood were not an ending but a reset. A moment when the world went back to an earlier state and had to be rebuilt from surviving pieces. Perhaps that is why the myths insist on the ark, on the saving of seeds and animals and knowledge. Because the point of the story is not destruction. It is continuity, the insistence that even when everything drowns, something survives. And from that survival, the world can be made again. The flood marks a dividing line. Not just in the king list, but in the way the Sumerians understood time itself. Before the flood, the impossible was ordinary. Rains measured in cosmic cycles. Knowledge descending from heaven. After the flood, time changed. Lifespans shortened. The connection to the divine weakened. And humanity, for the first time, was truly on its own. The next chapter explores what it means to live in a world after the gods have withdrawn, and why the memory of that withdrawal still haunts us. There is a pattern in the numbers. A slow descent, a gradual return to something we recognize as human. After the flood swept over, the Sumerian king list starts again. Kingship descended from heaven once more. It says, and landed in the city of Kish. But the numbers that follow are different, smaller. Still extraordinary by our standards, but no longer cosmic. The first king after the flood, Gaur, ruled for 1,200 years. The next, Gullinadabianapad, 960. Then 840. Then 720. With each successive reign, the numbers shrink. By the time the list reaches the third dynasty of Ur around 2000 BC, the reigns have dropped to decades, 30 years, 40 years. Lifespans that fit within the limits of what clay and memory could witness in a single generation. It is as if time itself changed. As if whatever allowed the antediluvian kings to rule for tens of thousands of years no longer worked after the waters went down. The world reset, and when it started again, it worked by different rules. The Sumerians were not alone in recording this pattern. In the book of Genesis, the family trees that follow the flood show the same gradual decline. Before the flood, the patriarchs lived impossibly long lives. Adam, 930 years. Seth, 912. Methuselah, the oldest, 969 years. Numbers that echo the structure of the Sumerian king list, scaled down but still far beyond normal human biology. Then the flood. And after it, the lifespans begin to shorten. Noah's son Shem lived 600 years. His son Arpachshad, 438. By the time we reach Abraham, the lifespan has dropped to 175 years. Moses lived 120 years, and even that was considered exceptional. By the time of King David, lifespans had settled into the range we still recognize today, 70 years. 80 if one is strong. The parallel is too exact to ignore. Two independent written traditions, separated by language, culture, and more than 1,000 years. Both describing the same thing. Long lifespans before the flood. A gradual shortening afterward. A world in which time or biology or the conditions of existence itself had fundamentally changed. But what does this pattern mean? One interpretation is purely symbolic. The long lifespans, in this view, represent the mythic time before history properly begins. The age of heroes and legends, when the boundaries between divine and human were not yet fixed. The shortening of time reflects the transition from mythic consciousness to historical consciousness. From a world understood through story to a world measured by the passage of generations. Another interpretation is family line-based. Perhaps the numbers represent dynasties rather than individuals. Methuselah ruled for 969 years, might mean the house of Methuselah lasted for nearly 1,000 years. The shortening of reigns would then reflect political instability after the flood, a breaking apart of power, the rise and fall of shorter-lived dynasties as the world struggled to reorganize itself. But there is a third possibility, one that both the Sumerian and Hebrew texts seem to suggest without stating directly. That something biological changed. That the conditions which allowed extraordinary longevity before the flood, whatever they were, no longer existed afterward. That humanity, in some fundamental way, had been lessened. The texts themselves frame it as a loss of connection. Before the flood, the Sumerians said the gods walked among humans. Kingship descended from heaven and was present on earth. The divine and the mortal mixed. After the flood, that connection weakened. The gods withdrew. Heaven closed. And humanity, left on its own, found itself subject to limits it had not known before. Genesis describes it similarly. Before the flood, the boundary between heaven and earth was open. Angels descended. God walked in the garden. The divine breath brought life to human clay. After the flood, God declares, "My spirit will not contend with humans forever, for they are mortal. Their days will be 120 years. A limit imposed, a separation made permanent." We might read this as theological symbolism, the inevitable distancing of the sacred from the ordinary. The arc of every mythology moving from a time when gods were near to a time when they are distant, when prayer replaces presence. Or we might read it as the texts themselves seem to present it, as a record of an actual transition. A moment when the world changed, when the conditions that had sustained one kind of existence gave way to another. When long lifespans, cosmic reigns, and divine presence were replaced by mortality, historical time, and human struggle. What could cause such a transition? If the flood was a catastrophic event large enough to be remembered across cultures for thousands of years, it might have changed more than geography. Climate shifts can affect human biology. Radiation from a cosmic impact could speed up mutation rates. Changes in atmospheric composition, in available nutrition, in the microbiome of the post-flood world, any of these could theoretically influence longevity. Modern science has no evidence for humans living hundreds of years. The oldest verified human lifespan is 122 years. But we also know that longevity is influenced by environment, by diet, by stress, by factors we are only beginning to understand through the study of epigenetics and the microbiome. Perhaps the ancients, looking back at their own history, interpreted changes in lifespan as evidence of a deeper transformation. A world that once supported extraordinary life now reduced to something more fragile. Or perhaps the shortening of time is not biological at all, but perceptual. Perhaps what changed was not how long people lived, but how they experienced time. In a world with fewer technologies, fewer records, fewer distractions, time might have felt slower, more expansive. A single lifetime containing what would later require multiple generations. The long reigns of the antediluvian kings might reflect a different relationship to time itself. A consciousness less broken up, more continuous, more connected to the rhythms of the cosmos. And when the flood came, when that world ended, time broke apart. History sped up, memory shortened, and humanity found itself living faster, dying sooner, unable to hold in one lifetime what had once been held. Whatever the cause, the effect is the same. The texts agree, something was lost. Some capacity, some connection, some condition of existence that allowed a different kind of time. And after the flood, humanity had to learn to live within limits it had not chosen. To build civilizations that would last longer than individual lives. To save knowledge across generations because no single generation could contain it anymore. Perhaps that is why the Sumerians wrote so constantly. Why they carved their knowledge into clay and baked it hard. Because they understood that time had become an enemy. That memory would fade. That what was not written would be forgotten. The shortening of lifespans made saving things urgent. And perhaps that is what the texts are really recording. Not just the decline in longevity, but the birth of history. The moment when humanity realized it was mortal. When time became something that had to be measured, recorded, fought against. When the present could no longer trust itself to remember the past without help. The sky closed, time sped up, and we have been racing ever since, trying to catch up with what we lost when the world reset and we woke to find ourselves limited. But if something was lost, perhaps something also remained. Not in books or tablets, but deeper. In the blood. In the patterns of thought and behavior that persist across generations. The next chapter asks whether the memory of that older world, that connection to something beyond ourselves, could survive not through culture, but through inheritance. Whether the myths of divine bloodlines and royal descent carry within them an echo of something we cannot quite put into words but somehow still carry. A genetic memory of the time before time began to run out. The myths did not end with clay tablets. They echo forward into every age, taking new forms, adopting new languages, but carrying the same essential structure. The story of descent from heaven, the claim to divine origin, the insistence that some connection, however fragile, still links humanity to something beyond itself. Walk through any museum of ancient history, and you will see the pattern repeated. Egyptian pharaohs called themselves sons of Ra, living gods who maintained cosmic order through their divine blood. Chinese emperors claimed the mandate of heaven, ruling not by conquest, but by celestial appointment. Japanese emperors traced their family line directly to the sun goddess Amaterasu. European kings were anointed with holy oil, transforming them from men into sacred vessels of divine authority. Across every culture that developed kingship, the same claim appears. Rulers are not merely powerful. They are different. Their blood carries something ordinary people lack. A connection to the divine, a mandate from the heavens, a genetic inheritance that justifies their power. But why? Why does this pattern persist? Why do civilizations separated by thousands of miles and thousands of years all arrive at the same mythology of divine descent? One answer is political. The claim to divine bloodlines is useful. It transforms random power into cosmic necessity. It makes rebellion not just illegal but sacrilegious. If the king is the son of heaven, then to oppose him is to oppose the gods themselves. The myth serves power. It always has. But there is something deeper in the persistence of this story. Something that goes beyond political convenience. Because the myth is not just about kings. It is about all of us. About the human need to believe we came from somewhere meaningful. That we are not accidents of biology but creations with purpose. That our origins connect us to something greater than the dust we will return to. In the modern age, this longing has found new expressions. Not through crowns and thrones, but through genetics, through the language of DNA, through the search for markers that might prove we are special, chosen, descended from something beyond the ordinary. One idea that has captured popular imagination is the Rh-negative blood type. About 15% of the global population lacks the Rh factor, a protein found on the surface of red blood cells. The distribution is uneven. Higher concentrations appear in the Basque region of Spain and France, in certain Celtic populations, in pockets of North Africa and the Middle East. The absence of the Rh factor is simply a genetic variation like eye color or height. It is inherited. It follows predictable patterns. And it has no bearing on intelligence, spirituality, or destiny. Medical science understands it completely. And yet around this ordinary biological trait, an entire mythology has grown. Some claim that Rh-negative blood proves extraterrestrial ancestry, that it is a marker of those descended from the Anunnaki, the Watchers, the beings who came from the sky. Others suggest it indicates a lost bloodline from Atlantis, or a remnant of Neanderthal genetics, or a sign of psychic abilities, or proof of royal descent. None of this is supported by evidence. The Rh-negative blood type arose through normal evolutionary processes. Its distribution reflects migration patterns, population bottlenecks, and random genetic drift. There is no scientific basis for claims that it indicates anything other than ordinary human variation. But the persistence of the mythology is worth noticing, because it reveals something about how humans think about inheritance. We want to believe that blood carries more than just biology, that it carries memory, identity, connection to the past. That somewhere in ourselves is written a story about who we were and who we are meant to become. This is the same impulse that drove the Sumerians to write about the blood of gods mixed with clay. The same longing that made pharaohs claim descent from Ra and emperors from heaven. The desire to find in our bodies evidence of a connection we feel but cannot prove. To look at ourselves and see traces of something that came from beyond the ordinary world. And perhaps that desire is not entirely unfounded. Not in the mystical sense, not in the way conspiracy theories imagine, but in a deeper, more subtle way. Because we do carry memory, not in the literal encoding of specific experiences into DNA, but in the patterns of culture and language that are passed down through generations. In the stories we tell about ourselves. In the myths we keep alive even when we no longer believe them. In the way certain ideas feel ancient even when we hear them for the first time. Carl Jung called this the collective unconscious. The notion that certain symbols, certain archetypes recur across cultures because they are part of the structure of human consciousness itself. The hero's journey, the divine child, the great mother, the descent into darkness and return to light. These patterns appear everywhere, not because they were transmitted through contact, but because they emerge from the way human minds work. Perhaps the myth of divine bloodlines is one of these archetypes. Not a memory of actual gods, but a psychological truth dressed in biological language. The recognition that we are connected to something larger than ourselves. That we inherit not just genes but histories. That every generation carries forward something of the ones that came before. And in that sense, the ancient claim is not entirely wrong. We do descend from the past. Every cell in our bodies contains the accumulated inheritance of 4 billion years of evolution. Every thought we think is shaped by languages and cultures developed over thousands of years. Every story we tell echoes stories told around fires before writing existed. We are not isolated individuals. We are the latest expression of something that has been becoming for longer than we can fully comprehend. But here is what matters. That inheritance is not limited to kings. It is not concentrated in certain bloodlines. It is not the exclusive property of those who claim divine descent. It belongs to all of us. Every human alive today carries the same deep history, the same evolutionary past, the same capacity for consciousness, for language, for wonder. There are no chosen bloodlines. There are only humans, all descended from the same ancient sources, all carrying the same inheritance forward into an uncertain future. The royal bloodlines were never about biology. They were about power, about creating divisions where none exist, about claiming that some people are closer to the divine than others. It is an old lie, repeated in every age, useful to those who benefit from it. But it remains a lie. What the myths really save is something more democratic, the memory that humanity as a whole came from somewhere, that we emerged somehow from a process we do not fully understand, that our origins contain mysteries we have not yet solved. Not because some of us are special, but because all of us are. Perhaps that is why the longing persists, not the longing to be more than others, but the longing to reconnect with what we sense we have lost. To close the gap between heaven and earth that opened after the flood. To remember what the Sumerians said we once knew. That knowledge came from the sky. That we are made from the mixing of dust and divinity. That the blood remembers, even if we cannot hear what it is saying. And so we return to where we began, to the clay tablets, to the impossible numbers, to the stories that should not have survived but did. The final chapter asks not what the Sumerians recorded, but why. Why save these memories at all? Why write them into clay and fire them hard and trust that someone thousands of years later would care enough to read them? Perhaps they were not just recording the past. Perhaps they were leaving instructions for the future. A message for a world that would one day need to remember what it means to be human, and what it might mean to become something more. In museums across the world, beneath glass and careful light, clay tablets rest in silence. Some no larger than a hand, others heavy as stone, each one pressed with marks that once carried the weight of empires, the exactness of astronomers, the longing of scribes who knew their world was ending and wrote anyway. If you could stand before one of them tonight, in the empty hours when the galleries close and the guards walk elsewhere, you might feel what the first archaeologists felt when they pulled these pieces from the earth. Not triumph, not the thrill of discovery, but something quieter. The awareness that you are holding a question that refuses to become an answer. We have journeyed through that question together. Through the impossible numbers of the king list. Through the descent of kingship from heaven. Through mathematical tablets that appeared already perfected. Through myths of blood mixed with clay. Through the flood that reset the world and the shortening of time that followed. We have traced the pattern across cultures and thousands of years. The insistence that knowledge came from the sky, that humanity was made, not born, that before the flood, time moved differently, that what we call history is only the latest chapter of something much older. And what have we found? Not proof, not certainty, not the kind of answers that close questions and let us move on. What we have found is the opposite. The realization that the questions are older than we imagined. That the mystery deepens the more closely we look. That every answer the Sumerians left us contains within it another question. Quieter, harder to hear. Perhaps that was their intention. Not to tell us what happened, but to remind us that something happened. Not to solve the mystery of our origins, but to save the awareness that our origins are mysterious. That we emerged from a process we do not fully understand. That the past is not a solved equation, but a living presence. Still speaking, still waiting to be heard. The clay tablets are not really about the past. They are about us, about what we choose to remember and what we allow ourselves to forget. About the knowledge we claim as invention when it might be inheritance. About the longing we feel for connection to something beyond ourselves. A longing so deep that every culture has tried to name it, and every name has been both true and insufficient. The Sumerians wrote that kingship descended from heaven. We write that consciousness emerged from evolution. Perhaps these are not opposites. Perhaps they are the same story told in different languages, separated by the limits of what each age can see. The fingerprints are still there, pressed into clay 5,000 years ago. The same ridges and swirls that mark your fingers now. The same human hand, reaching across time, leaving a trace, saying, I was here. I knew something. I tried to write it down before it vanished. And it did not vanish. Not completely. The clay survived. The words survived. The questions survived. And perhaps that is the real message. Not what the Sumerians knew, but what they understood about knowing itself. That it is fragile. That civilizations rise and fall. That memory fades. That the connection between heaven and earth, if it ever existed, grows thinner with every generation. But also that saving is possible. That what is written in clay can last longer than stone. That a single tablet, carefully made, carefully kept, carefully read, can carry a voice across 5,000 years. That we are not alone in the dark. That others before us faced the same silence and chose to speak into it anyway. The answers may not be written in stone. They may not be written at all. But they are within us. In the patterns of thought we inherit without knowing their source. In the myths we repeat without understanding why. In the questions we keep asking even when we suspect there are no answers. In the feeling, common to every human who has ever looked at the stars, that we came from somewhere and might one day return. Close your eyes now if you haven't already. Let the weight of the day settle. Let the questions rest. The tablets will still be here in the morning, silent under glass, waiting as they have waited for thousands of years. The past is not gone. It is only sleeping. And perhaps in the space between waking and dreaming, you might hear what it has been trying to say all along. That we are the clay and the fingerprint both. The question and the answer. The memory and the forgetting. The dust from which we came and the breath that moved across it. Once, long ago, in a time before time began. Rest now. The story is not finished. It never was.